Hi, I'm Margot Conahan with ACRL, and I'm pleased to introduce this webcast being offered jointly by the ALA Office for Diversity, Literacy, and Outreach Services and the Association of College and Research Libraries. We had an engaging live webcast last week with a couple hundred participants logged in for the session. Unfortunately, technology wasn't on our side and the webcast failed to record. But thankfully, our presenter graciously offered to re-record the webcast, which is what you're hearing today. And we'll also answer a few of the questions that came in through the chat last week at the end of today's session. So let me start by introducing our presenter, Tawana Hodge. Tawana is a graduate of the University of Washington Information School. She was the diversity resident librarian at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City and was the previous information literacy and collection development librarian at the University of Virgin Islands, St. Thomas. Tawana is also a 2013 ALA Spectrum Scholar. Thanks for being back with us today, Tawana, and whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Okay, sorry. Thank you, Margot, for that wonderful introduction. So, hi, my name is Tawana Hodge. My pronouns are she, her, hers. This presentation is called Addressing Cultural Humility and Implicit Bias in Information Literacy Sessions. And a lot of this work was generated through the work that Lorelei Rutledge and Alfred Madu did at the University of Utah when I was the diversity resident librarian there. So these are our session outcomes. So I'm hoping that as a result of today's webinar that you not only meet these outcomes are not only met, but also you learn more about the questions during the Q&A portion of the presentation. But I wanted you guys to really take away the importance of learning about your implicit biases, about your unconscious biases. To think of this as an educational opportunity to delve more into it and to see how it does impact our relations to our patrons, as well as the services and programming and information literacy sessions that we provide. And so these are some conversation guidelines that I would like for you all to keep in the back of your mind. And thanks to Deborah Daniels at the University of Utah Women's Resource Center for giving me permission to be able to use these. So respect and listening, utilizing I statements. You can also use these if you're going to have any follow-up conversations regarding cultural humility and implicit bias. The right to feeling honored and present, the right to disagree, the right to risk or to pass, assume good intentions, and to stay open to the process. And I know that it might be uncomfortable. You might find some level of discomfort, but I believe that learning happens through discomfort. And so through this presentation, that most of you guys are going to be uncomfortable or experience some level of discomfort, and that means that you're learning. So according to the ALA Code of Ethics, we provide the highest level possible of service, but we also want to provide accurate, unbiased, and courteous responses to all requests. And so how can we do that if we are not aware of our implicit biases? We might be aware of our explicit biases, but if we want to provide unbiased responses to all requests, we need to figure out what is our underlying biases are. And I'll talk a little bit more about what is implicit bias, what is explicit bias, and why the implicit association test is a way to begin to figure out what your underlying biases may be, because our biases do impact our day-to-day lives and our professional and personal lives. Now, this is the racial and ethnic breakdown or family origin breakdown that was conducted last year through the ALA Office of Research and Statistics. And the reason why I have this up is to say that the profession is 86.7% white. So it's a predominantly white profession. And in these arenas of academic research, libraries, it's the same thing, where a majority of the librarians are white. And so we strive to provide safe and brave and comfortable spaces, but you have to understand that your racial and ethnic identities does influence how the teacher will or will not interact with you. So I believe in terms of you understanding what your racial identity is, how that impacts others, and how there are certain biases that is tied to particular racial and ethnic groups, and that influences you and how your conversations that you hold and the sessions that you hold with your teachers from different backgrounds. Now, before I dive into talking about implicit bias, I want to make sure that everyone is on the same page in terms of being able to define what bias is in this context, as well as attitude. Okay, so in some cases, bias is used as a synonym for preference or area of interest, as in I read books from all genres with a bias towards science fiction. However, in this case, we are defining bias as prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way considered to be unfair, according to the Oxford English Dictionary. Some of our biases have no impact on the larger world. For instance, I could say I prefer mangoes over pineapples, and that preference does not affect anyone but me. However, some of our biases, such as a preference for white people over people of color, can influence us and those we interact with negatively both on an individual and social level. I also want to point out that bias is different than an attitude which can be either a favorable or unfavorable feeling towards a thing or thought, which can be positive or negative. Now, you all have access to a list of definitions, a conversation guidelines, and some other little goodies that you guys have access to. So please don't worry, you'll be able to utilize these and to learn more about these different things. Now, with that, we tend to process, there's so much bits of information that is happening at any given time. And we can only really process about 40 bits out of the 11 million bits of information that is around us. So in order to avoid being completely overwhelmed by the world around us, our bodies and minds filter that information for us, our brains. One of the ways our brains does this for us is by creating automatic associations, connecting bits of information together for us. Many of the automatic associations develop over time, without us necessarily even being aware of them. And this happens because the neurons in our brains fire when we take in information. So this is what's happening right now as you listen to this webinar. You may have heard the phrase, neurons that fire together, wire together. Over time, our automatic associations are reinforced and they become more powerful. And these automatic associations form the bedrock of our biases. There are explicit biases, as I mentioned before. These are the kind of biases we are aware of and we have control over. So these are the biases we tend to think of when we describe someone as sexist, racist, or homophobic. However, it might make more sense to think of bias in terms of implicit bias as well. Implicit biases are the negative attitudes or stereotypes that we are unaware of that still influence our behavior. It is also important to note that our implicit biases may not necessarily match up with our explicit biases. When we are dealing with implicit biases, most of them are happening at a subconscious level and wouldn't necessarily say we agree with them if someone was to ask us. However, with many implicit cognitions, we have no access to them. They are buried in our subconscious. Elements that make up implicit biases unique are that they are pervasive. All of us have countless implicit biases that we have learned over time. They are separate and distinct from implicit biases or beliefs in most cases. And lastly, they take consistent long-term effort to change, but are malleable and can be changed over time. So the next question that you might have is, how do I know if I have a bias and if it's implicit? One way that you can go about identifying what your implicit biases may be is through taking an implicit association test. Now, this is just one of the other ways that you can gain access to what some of your implicit biases may be. Now, some people tend to be defensive or angry or tend to push back against the feedback that they've received, the score that they've received, as well as the validity of the test. I'm not saying that this test, this instrument, this tool is perfect, but it gives you an insight into what your implicit biases could be. Now, the implicit association test works by measuring how quickly you can relate specific kinds of words with other words. As the name implies, implicit association test does not measure biases or prejudices that one is aware of, but rather measures the strength of associations between concepts that we are unaware of. The reason we do this indirect measurement is because biases are unconscious. So most people aren't able to tell us accurately what their biases may be. So this result is my result that I've taken about a year and a half ago, and it suggests that I have a slight automatic preference for young compared to old. Now, this would be the opportunity for me once to get my feedback, and it also provides you, if you provide them a little data, it also provides you a score along with what other people have scored as well. For me, having a slight young preference compared to old could mean in terms of the society, the culture that I live in, privilege or acknowledge or young people or youthfulness over old. Okay. Now that you know more about what is a bias, what is implicit bias, explicit bias, attitude, and more, here are some bias-reducing strategies that I have gathered from these other amazing authors and scholars out there. So the first one is stereotype replacement. So it's recognizing that a stereotype has been activated. Think about why, and then actively substitute in non-stereotypical thought. Okay, so for an example of this would be thinking of Caribbean people as lazy or typically laid back. Now, first of all, is usually when you think of a stereotype, kind of think about how quickly that comes to mind. And so as a result of our culture, kind of a cultural residue, these automatic association that comes from our, as we grew up in our society and the culture that we live in. So very problematic that you could think of so many different stereotypes and not positive ones either. But the one I'm using is that Caribbean people are lazy or they're laid back. So for me, I feel comfortable talking about this because I'm from the Caribbean. Thinking about why is this because of how Caribbean people are portrayed. That in the islands, they just drink and dance, and there's island time where everyone takes their time and they're laid back. And then I think about all of the Caribbean people that I know, particularly Haitians in particular. I feel like one of the hardest working people that I know. Okay, and so instead of me just looking at it and just identifying it, looking at why, and then substituting it for a non-stereotypical thought. The other one is counter-stereotypic imaging. Imagine an individual situation that counteracts your stereotype reaction in detail. For instance, if I realized that I was assuming that women are bad drivers, which they are not, I could take a moment to imagine a woman being a really great driver. And for another example is that an experiment showed that students exposed to images of famous African Americans showed a weaker pro-white bias, according to research done by Bernard and Greenwald. The other one is individuation. Recognize when you have stereotyped someone according to their group affiliation, and then try to think about things that make them an individual. Okay? So for me, when I encounter people, it's very easy for those implicit biases to just kind of like a knee-jerk reaction to just kind of snap in place. It happens unconsciously, and it's so automatic because sometimes we don't realize that it's happening. But one thing that I try not to do, that I try to do, is to look at people as individuals, that they have hopes, wish, dreams, fears, and people that love them for who they are. And so I just don't look at them based on the color of their skin, don't look at them based on their gender, or if they have a physical disability, and more. And there's a difference between invisible minorities and visible minorities as well, and their intersecting identities. The next one is perspective taking. Think about what it would be like to be a member of the group. So this is very similar to taking a walk in someone else's shoes. So really looking at what would it be like to be a member of that racial or ethnic or nationality, that group. Okay, and though I know that I'll never know what it is actually like to experience life as a white male or Native American or Latina, there is enough ex life experiences in many different formats and mediums where one can learn about those experiences. But to understand that each person is an individual, that they do have similar experiences, but not every experience is the exact same. The other one is positive contact. So increasing opportunities for positive contact with members of a stereotype group. So finding opportunities to meet people that are different. So this is an opportunity in particular for information literacy sessions, that you have the students sit with different people. So if you see them kind of like clustering, as long as they don't clustering in groups, if they have a group project, to have them sit in different groups. And this could be a part of any group activity that you want to utilize in your information literacy session. But letting them know that it is through interaction with others from different communities that you actually learn about them. You understand their trials and tribulations and their suffering. Okay, and then you be able to reduce those stereotypical thoughts, to reduce that bias response that you have when you interact with people from those different groups. The other one is recategorization. The intergroup contact that introduces members of different groups to recategorize themselves as members of the same, more inclusive group, can reduce prejudice through cognitive and motivational processes involving in-group favoritism. Okay. So when you have people, members of a different group, being able for them to recategorize themselves, reclassify, reorganize themselves in a different group. So if everyone in the group is from the same racial or ethnic background or nationality, that as they talk amongst themselves, they're able to reclassify themselves as they love anime and manga and they love cosplaying. And so do you identify more things that they are a part of their similarities and not just focusing on their differences? And the last, and certainly not least, is interpersonal interactions and cross-group friendships. Providing intergroup contact that leads to interpersonal interactions provides opportunity for members of one group to develop positive emotional reactions and recognize individual attitudes, talents, interests among people in the other group. Cross-group friendships have cascading effects because friends of those involved in cross-group friendships are affected by the knowledge that their friends have close friendships with out-group members. So when you're able to, in your personal life and in your professional life, have people from different groups, people from different identities, that you are able to speak on behalf of them when they are not there. You're more of an advocate than a spokesperson. You're able to prevent people from using racial slurs or prevent microaggressions or micro-invalidations from occurring when you actually have these interpersonal interactions and cross-group friendships. You're able to understand these communities' historical trauma better, to understand what is currently happening in their communities, when you are involved with people who are a part of those communities. Now, I'm not saying running out there and going and having a friend who's part of the LGBTQT or a black friend or a Native American or anything of that nature. Okay, all I am saying is that through exposure, okay, through willingly exposing yourself to different people, taking a look at your circles, taking a look at the people you work with, people who are in your friends and family circle, people you're in committees with, and identifying, where are your gaps. If you realize that all of your friends are white, well-to-do, um, all of them are, well educated and things of that nature, that you're kind of in a bubble. Okay, and that bubble, despite the fact that people like to think that their personal life does not impact their professional life, well, it does. And so being able to understand different people and from their different perspective, and not looking at it from a place of power and prestige or privilege, or even looking at it as being a savior, but looking at it by being humble. And so this is where kind of cultural humility comes into play. So cultural humility is the ability to maintain an interpersonal stance that is other-oriented. Okay? So you're very open to the other in relation to aspects of cultural identity that is more important to the student or your patron, whoever they may be. Okay? So it's not thinking that you are competent in their culture, that culture is all of a sudden these check boxes we could just check off. Okay, I understand the language, I understand the food, I understand this and that, the rituals and traditions. Culture change as people change, so you can never feel that you are 100% understand any one culture, because everything is constantly words and their meaning changes. Okay? But understanding that the person that you're working with, their lived experiences, their life experiences is just as valuable. Okay? That you're coming together as two experts, that you have this set of information that this patron or the students need, but you're not looking at it from a place of power, that you are making it a level playing field, that there's no huge power dynamics that is happening. Okay? And you're trying to learn much about the person. Okay, you're not basing your interaction with them based on the whatever identities that you can ascribe from their appearance. Okay, you're not pigeonholing them or putting them into a box or category. Okay, you're looking at them through a lens of individuation as well. Okay, but understanding their culture, their predominant identity, you're not aware of that, and you are humbling yourself and being willing to learn more about them and their culture. So, strategies for information literacy. So, to use a non-dominant first-person perspective. So, when you are creating your LibGuide, when you are creating tutorials, when you are creating even just using sample searches, utilizing the non-dominant first-person perspective, looking at who is here, who is not, who is missing. Okay, the fact that you, sorry, the fact that utilizing different people's experiences, looking at if you're presenting on a topic of environmental racism, looking at utilizing scholars of color in your work and not just utilizing white male scholars. Okay, lived experience. Okay, utilizing the different lived experiences, the different voices. Okay, utilizing content that is written by people in those communities, not other people who's outside of those communities writing about them. Okay, acknowledging the power, acknowledging the credibility and validity that comes with lived experiences. Encouraging groups to explain their reasoning. So if there's a phrase or a stereotypical thought that was said aloud, asking somebody to explain their thought, explain their reasoning, explain their prejudice or bias. kind of breaking it down for them, despite the fact that you may have only 30 minutes or 50 minutes, working with the instructor prior to, especially if it's on a difficult or challenging or triggering topic, that you expect what the classroom management rules are, but also expecting to take time to work through this, okay? Because sometimes if you have someone who says a thought and it's not acknowledged, then everyone feels uncomfortable, and then there's students in the room who might, that thought, that phrase might have been aimed towards, do not feel safe, they do not feel protected, do not feel as though they belong. Okay? And they use examples that reverse common stereotypes. As I mentioned before, utilizing examples of intelligent, smart inventors of community of colors, of underrepresented groups, showing people the rarity, showing people the individuality that exists in these underrepresented communities, that there's no danger of a single story, and that there's a multitude of experiences that's represented. And discussing class, race, social class, and privilege, and that these things do influence these students' identities, our identities, and what they have or don't have access to at their university or at their place. So classroom strategies. So inclusive search strategies. So now this just goes beyond using the Boolean search operators and or not, phrase searching and things of that nature, but looking at what words are we utilizing, okay, when we use these different search strategies, okay? The difference between natural language query and control vocabulary, but even talking about how certain control vocabularies is very racist, okay? It's perpetuating certain stereotypes. Okay, and being able, I know that if you are teaching to first-year students, that might not be something you want to go in depth on, but really just touching on the importance of the words that you choose, generating searchable keywords, but that these keywords, these controlled vocabularies, these subject terms, are controlled by, if you're in academia, the Library of Congress subject headings, which is perpetuating a white dominant perspective. And so certain words, certain terms that communities of colors or underrepresented communities might use are not actually considered a subject term. So they may not find items that on them unless it's an author supplied keywords. But even just touching on that is important. Using real life experiences, using the things that has happened in the news, using that there was a University of Alabama student who profusely used the N-word in a video and posted it, and subsequently she was expelled. She was from her university and from her sorority, and really talking about what the impacts of racism has in this day and age, talking about what the impact that racial slurs have on certain communities. Okay, talking about the impact of the missile crisis on Hawaii. Okay, these are some examples talking about the recent Trump comment regarding countries in Africa and Haiti. Okay, so these are some things that can be discussed, talking about whiteness, talking about colonialism. That is important, not just building up one exhibit and just talking about it one time, but really diving deep into these prevalent topics. Supports faculty by filling traditional roles of librarianship. So the things that we typically do, the reference interactions, the teaching, our liaison duties, understanding that how we continue to do our work, but to continue to do it in different ways that is being more inclusive to everyone involved. But to understand that sometimes to be inclusive, you have to be exclusive. Sometimes you have to focus on certain communities, learning about them, working with them, okay, in order for you to make them feel more comfortable, okay, to understand that these universities and colleges are not becoming less diverse, they're becoming more diverse. And what are we doing to help those in our classrooms, in these places? Gain, looking at deaf gain, looking at different disabilities, not as a loss, but as a gain, at these different things that that impacts them negatively, because we tend to operate on a very ableist society that it makes it, if you have a kind of a physical disability, that you are other, that you have to walk around the whole library and use the loading dock as an example, use the loading dock just to get into the library. So what are we doing in those cases, okay, to make it acceptable, talking about these things, not just the basic ADA compliance, okay, talking about different mental and physical disabilities as a gain and not a loss. And being an ally, okay, not calling yourself an ally, okay, letting that community that you are working with to identify you as such, showing up when your support is needed, using your privilege, okay, using your advantages to help benefit that community. Okay, so as I mentioned before, it's being an advocate, not being a spokesperson. Utilize understanding that these communities, they will be able to dictate what you can and cannot help out with. And being an ally is not just showing up, taking a selfie, and then walking out and just putting it and saying hashtag Black Lives Matter, and that's it. Okay, so talking about what is allyship, what does that mean, what does that look like? Not just professionally, but personally as well. And even just using that as an example depending on what it is that you're discussing in your information literacy session. So the ACRL framework, so information has value. So information does have value, and that value is dependent on what community that you are a part of. As you all know, people call this the information age, and you have more access to information than you ever did before, okay? But even so, why is that stereotypes are perpetuated at such high rates now? Now that we have Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and Snapchat, that you think with all of this information that people have at their fingertips, that they'd be able to educate themselves about these different communities instead of continuing to perpetrating these stereotypes and these bias and prejudiced thoughts and attitudes, okay? And that the fact that in certain cases, medical professionals, doctors, there's some who believe that African Americans have a high tolerance for pain, that we do not feel pain at the same level as other races and ethnicities. And then that colors, that perception, that stereotype colors, okay, how they will prescribe pain medication, that treatment. So imagine that these are doctors, these are people who have gone through formal education, but then their biases, okay, their perceptions negatively impacts their treatment of their patients. Okay? And this is not the only case where implicit biases have real-world detrimental effects on the communities that these people treat. Okay? You can just think of all the people of transgender, women of color, men of color who have died at the hands of people who are supposed to serve and protect them. Okay? So though we have information at our fingertips, that some information is valued over others. And why is that? And then having access to that information. information poverty versus information privilege. That certain, based on how much money you have and university has, that they may not be able to provide an adequate amount of access to information. Now, you might think about Google. Google is not necessarily in the business of providing you access to information, okay? That you still hit different paywalls, okay? And then some of these databases and these websites, they're not screen reader friendly. So now going back and thinking about people who have different or different abilities, what exactly is being done to better to better include them in these things? And then thinking about authority is constructed and contextual. Okay. In my information literacy sessions, I used to talk about this one and talk about credentials, authority. Okay, what makes something authoritative, credible, verifiable? Okay, now there's a difference between someone who has a PhD in biomedical engineering, writing about their experiences, a white person, a white male who has a PhD in biomedical engineering, writing about the experiences of what it's like to be a student of color or female of color, black female student, experience at a historically black college or university. Okay, they have the credential. They don't necessarily have that lived experience. Okay, so they're not calls into question credibility and relevancy. And so these are some of the things that you want to keep in mind when you are talking about lived experiences versus looking at lived experiences and credentials. Okay. Next up is programmatic examples. Okay. So at the University of Utah, there's two classes. There's one, what is normal, and diversity and health. So these are just some examples of what people can do to reach out to classes that are not a part of their, that they might not be embedded of, or that's not typically like writing 101 or research and writing 201 classes like these. I understand that there are some people who have a much heavier load than others, but reaching out to classes like these gives you the ability to, one, help with collection development to see if you actually have resources to support classes like these and others, but it provides that exposure to different content, different theories, as well as exposure to different faculty members as well that could be in your department or could not be in your department. The one thing that I love about librarianship is that a lot of our experiences, personal or otherwise, can help somebody, as you never know what it is that we know and how it can help someone else. So despite the fact that it may not be within your collecting area or your liaison area, that's always a good thing to seek out different classes and see kind of like how can the library help support or better support these classes. And then one thing that if your university or college has is learning communities, reaching out to them and being able to offer, like there's liaisons for certain departments and academic centers and what's not. You can also offer, that could be a similar model for learning communities, okay? So usually for a LEAP at the University of Utah, the students complete general requirements, okay? So there's a peer advisor and librarian involvement, and several sections are adopted the AAC and U value rubrics. And so for the LEAP fall semester, this is inquiry-based learning. There's a lot of individual, paired, and group work. This is where the individuation, positive contact, these bias-reducing strategies can come into play. Okay, these are where students kind of learn about their research skills, develop a sense of community, and kind of acknowledge their explicit and implicit biases and be able to work on reducing them throughout this class. And so for at the University of Utah, there's a librarian that is embedded, and so that they get to see the students in the fall semester and then the spring semester. So in the spring semester, they focus on different books, and so really supporting the students, supporting the LEAP program is more than just identifying books that is relevant to the course, but making sure that it's relevant to the communities that will be impacted by the content. So in this case, this was focused on biomedical ethics, bioethics for this semester, and they engaged in a pro-con debate looking at vulnerable populations and things of that nature, and being able to have them kind of think critically about the content that they're coming across, thinking about who is represented in the population size, what kind of population is represented, who is not represented, and things of that nature when it comes to looking at items like these. Now, some areas for growth. Now, there's a lot of things that we could be doing. First and foremost is a critical analysis of ourselves. I truly believe in order for us to work on being a more equitable and a more inclusive society, but also profession, as well as personally, is that we need to do a critical analysis of ourselves. What are we doing wrong? What is missing? Who's not being engaged? Okay, do people feel like they belong or that they're familiar? Okay, these are some things that we need to keep in mind. Okay, and then to have discourse around critical race theory, whiteness and white fragility, social justice, critical librarianship, and critical pedagogy. And there's a lot of people in the profession who are experts when it comes to these different topics. And there's conferences, there's conference themes and sessions around these many topics. And if these are new themes and concepts to you, I suggest that you get started learning more about them, because our identities do impact the way that we perceive the world, but also the way that the world perceives us. The next steps. So this just goes beyond information literacy sessions. So a lot of the things that I've talked about is great for information literacy sessions, but things that you could also take outside of the classroom. So community involvement. Okay, there might be some universities and colleges that have a public engagement librarian, and they may not. But being able to engage in the different community, figuring out what communities your students are a part of, and then hosting opportunities for positive contact. If there are affiliated programs where like the Westside Leadership Institute, where they are able to come into the library and we provide an information literacy session for them. By being able to identify different programming like those, where you can bring other members of the community into the library and to be able to see what the library has to offer and how the library resources does match or can help with whatever it is that is occurring in their lives. Also define stereotypes by creating exhibits and holding environments. So it just goes beyond, as I mentioned, just creating an exhibit of different countries or just Black History Month and leaving it at that, but delving into the different issues within the Black community, things that impact the Black or African American community or experience, or looking at the impact of colonialism on countries, on African countries, and on countries in the Caribbean. Okay, provide opportunities for positive contact. So this is, you could be hosting like video nights, but hosting opportunities where you can watch a movie and have a discussion afterward. Okay, so these are just some of the few things that can be done to not only reduce different people's explicit and implicit biases, but to also provide more inclusive and greater services to the members of the different communities. Next steps, promote implicit bias and cultural humility on a programmatic level. Discuss implicit bias in an information literacy framework and question how your biases may affect the services you provide at your library. Okay, so this is some of the things that you all are already doing, which is great, but there is more work to be done. It's more moving from a conversation of educating to doing something with the knowledge that you all are gaining. And for further discussion, so this is something that can be utilized and is a part of the little packet of goodies that you all have access to that you can have for future discussion, thinking about how these strategies, bias reducing strategies, can be used to combat implicit bias in your library, thinking about when you witness it, and if there's any of the strategies that was talked about today that has already been used or could be used to yourself using, and how you could go about using it or how you have used it already. Some takeaways: to accept that we do in fact have biases, and to make ourselves aware of them. Okay, so even if your plan is to take all of the IATs, which is great, but also taking a look at how you interact with people or don't interact with people, how you tend to lean towards certain perspectives and ways of thinking and mindset than others. To exchange our own automatic biases for different, more inclusive notions, and to understand that you will make mistakes. I do make mistakes. No one person is perfect or completely bias-free. Okay, and to understand that it happens, to apologize and to not make it about you. Okay, to apologize and to move on. To determine not only to unearth our own stereotypes, but to also challenge them. There will always be people who uphold stereotypes, and there will always be people who threaten them as well. But to understand that stereotypes is a generalization, and that does not help anybody. You can end up losing out on a great friendship, being able to help a student just because of the stereotypes that you cling to or tend to hold on to. And to be a part of the conversation. So I just wanted to thank you all for tuning into this webinar. I appreciate all of the interest that this has received, and I just have to say thank you again to Lorelei Rutledge and Alfred Madu for their tremendous help in this, that we presented on this about a year and a half ago, and this has since been updated to include some new stuff. But yeah, and just thank you all for being here today. And the quote that I want to point out to you all is that if we can't see a problem, we can't fix a problem. So always keep that in mind as we go on. And then these are some free webinars. The first one is one that has passed already, and then the last one is an upcoming webinar. And these are my lovely references and questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Tawana. So I have some questions that came in from participants from last week's webcast that I'll go ahead and share for you to address and respond to. So one of the questions asked last week was asking, have you ever engaged student groups for programming or displays? And what advice do you have for librarians who might want to do that?
So I've never had the opportunity to engage them for programming or displays. That's a wonderful question. One thing that I did when I was at the University of Utah is that I reached out to student organizations that was affiliated with the Center for Ethnic Students Affairs, and I talked about who I was, what my roles were, and kind of just did a little brief orientation about like the library resources and services. So just that they get to know me and that they feel comfortable with me and that they have a familiar face in the library, so that if they were to be interested in doing an exhibit with me, that they would know me and be able to come to me, and then I would be able to direct them to the right person. But if you are thinking of approaching them on just creating an exhibit, kind of thinking about what exhibit it is that you're going to be creating, why you're approaching that particular student group and that student organization, kind of like their affiliation with the topic in hand. Reaching out to them if there is a process, because some universities do have a process for like the exhibits. It has to be done 3 months in advance, 6 months in advance. If it's a bigger exhibit, it's like a book display, kind of identifying books with that, but to just be very clear about what exactly it is that you envision and how that student organization can help make that vision a reality, but also including the fact that they might want something else than what you envision, and to be able to say kind of like what the student organization would get out of working with you all instead of just just a book display and things of that nature. So I think it's just being very open about what it is that you want to do and why you are approaching them, and then to kind of have that discussion with them and or with their faculty or staff advisor, and then working with the other members, if it's like a large exhibit, if you want to highlight things from special collections, then taking the time and the planning to do so. And if there's going to be any educating more than just the exhibit or the book display.
Great, thank you so much. Another question that we received was asking about cultural bias. This person was wondering, how can we identify cultural bias in our library services?
Okay. So cultural bias, I'm thinking of cultures like language, attitude, behaviors, traditions, and norms, and the fact that different cultures have different traditions, beliefs, ways of different lifestyles, different language, as well as different ways of thinking about certain things. So in terms of if you were wondering if there is a cultural bias in any of your services or resources or anything of that nature, just because we live in the United States of America, which has a very westernized, European, white, ethnocentric way of thinking and doing things, there's already automatically a cultural bias there. So, also thinking about like what is it that happens in ways of library services that occurs in different cultures and different communities that are abroad. So something that you can think about doing is looking at what different library services are offered in, say, universities and colleges in Ghana or India or Egypt and things of that nature, and seeing like, are we privileged? Are we definitely privileging certain cultures over the others, and what ways is that happening? And then also looking at like the services that and resources that you provide, and looking at like if the community member from this particular culture was to come and ask about X, would you be able to assist them? So if I came out to a desk and asked about African hairstyles and African hairstyles regarding culture, would that person be able to help me with resources? Or if I came in wearing a hijab, or if I had a African print cloth on my head, would that be kind of acceptable? Okay, so this is just going, not just going in terms of like our patrons, but also the people that we work with as well. So kind of thinking about what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, but what is not acceptable is because of our culture and trying to be more open-minded to these different cultures.
Great, thanks so much, Tawana. Another question that came last week was asking around inclusive search strategies. So wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how to incorporate inclusive search strategies.
So I think I mentioned before, just going beyond the phrase searching and the parentheses and things of that nature and the Boolean search operators, and talking more about the terminologies that and the vocabulary that is used. So for inclusive search strategies, uh, thinking about who has been left out and why, and being able to uh, be more sorry. I hope someone is very good at editing. Um, Thinking more about inclusive search strategies, thinking more about not just the terminology, not just about the Boolean search operators, but also looking more into the databases that is being utilized or not utilized, as well as the content and how that content is displayed and it's not displayed in terms of how these search strategies are utilized.
Thank you. So here's sort of a tricky one that came in last week. There was lots of conversation around this, I remember, from the chat. So there was a question about implicit bias in the library, and so this person was saying, we often see implicit bias in the library, but how can we safely interrupt it when the person who is engaging in this behavior is in a higher position of power than us?
Yes, that is a very tricky one, I must say. And for all those people that is looking for a well thought out answer, I'm just gonna say two words. It's contextual. I say that because if there's a person of authority and they are perpetuating a microaggression or implicit bias, and it is at and it's occurring, whether you're a witness or it's happening to you, there's that power dynamic that is involved. And so being able to call someone out does take a measure of guts. And then being able to look at what exactly was said or done, okay, and looking at the circumstances, is that the right time to intervene? Because certain things, depending on what is said and what is happening, if it's if you are the employee and it's your boss and they said something to you that was mildly disagreeing and very not insensitive, culturally or racially insensitive, that if you are alone, that you talk to them about it, that you take steps to kind of open their eyes to why what they said or what they did is wrong. And if they don't kind of like heed your ability to just talk it out, to hash it out, then if there is incident bias report that your university, your college have to do that and follow up with it, because it's more than likely things just don't happen one-off. It really does. And so if this is something that has happened to you or you've seen happen to someone else, then there's a likelihood that it might have happened already. And so, but you also want to take care of yourself. So self-care is definitely important, that if you do call them out or call them in, that you're taking the responsibility on yourself to educate them if they are even open to being educated. But also, taking care of that context. So as I said before, it is contextual. It does depend. But I would say that to document it, whether it's happening to you, happening to somebody else, and then to see if you can have that conversation with them, if not then and there, then at a later date and time. But if you receive pushback, then you go to someone else and follow any processes there, if there are, in place to rectify that issue, because you do not want it to continue. And then for other people to be subjected to that insensitivity or to that bias or biases.
Great, thank you. Another question was asking if you could explain a bit more about what cultural humility means.
Okay. So for cultural humility, It is, well, I will kind of use another definition from Trevelyan and Marie Garcia. It's developing and maintaining a mutually respectful and dynamic partnership with communities on behalf of individual patients and communities. So it is that you are respectful of that person and where they come from, that you are humbling yourself, that you are not seeing yourself as better than as superior, or you're not seeing them as inferior, okay? That there is a level of respectfulness, a level of acceptance of who they are, okay? And also understanding that for some people to come to you, that, you know, that's a level of anxiety that they have or had to get over in order to in order for them to come to you for whatever their problem may be. Okay? So knowing that you do not know everything there is to know about this person or their culture, and to understand it, to be open-minded to learning more about them and their culture from their perspective. So that's just another way of kind of defining cultural humility.
Thank you. So I have two more questions for us to get through. So this one is a little long. I'll try to go slowly. Do you think it is safe to have students discuss or share their experiences regarding information privilege within one-shots, specifically since sometimes this privilege is associated with racial and ethnic disparities? You had information privilege versus poverty on one side. Can you explain more?
So it's a lot to kind of delve into information poverty, as well as a students of color's perspective that could be impacted by class and race as well, especially if you only have 50 minutes or 90 minutes. But to also, one, to make sure that the environment is a open environment, it's a holding environment, that there is room for these discussions to be had, not just in your information literacy session, but working with a faculty member to make sure that if something were to be said about this, or this was to be brought up by either you or maybe another student in the class, that to acknowledge it if you have 5 minutes to spend on it. And if there's a student who is willing to volunteer, but not to force the issue, because you do not want it to seem that they're just a representative for any of their identities. But working with the faculty member to make sure that it's followed up with in the next course session or anything like of that nature. And so if there is room, if the student feels that they want to discuss this, providing some conversational guidelines, some rules in place to make sure that this conversation is kept on track, but that anything that is said is set in confidentiality for educational purposes, the use of I statements, and to understand that this is one person's perspective, that cannot be used to generalize other people's perspective, and understanding of the vulnerability that is happening there, and being careful of handling that in a safe and supportive manner, by making it, and then being also you offering yourself up to be vulnerable as well. So there's a lot of vulnerability going on here, but this also, it might not have to be able to be impacted or unpacked in one session, but there is a way for you to be able to create a LibGuide, or to provide a document or anything like that, where they can continue to have these discussions. And it can be, and then you can develop a resource list or anything like that to provide supporting sources for whatever was discussed in that class session.
Great, thank you. And our final question for today is if you can talk some about using gender fair language during instruction sessions.
So So I'm assuming in terms of utilizing he, she, them, their, as well in terms of like non-gender conforming language, it's to use it, as I used it in the beginning of this presentation, is to use it to the point that it becomes normalized, that if somebody says that their pronouns are them, their, that if they use that they're automatically outing themselves, as other people don't typically use that. So being able to use that not just in instruction sessions, but in your personal life is important, because you are supporting that person, whatever that their gender identity might be for the day. And it can just be as simple as saying, "Hi, my name is Tawana Hodge. My pronouns are she, her, hers. What pronouns are you using today?" Okay, and then educating the other students in the use of their gender identity, of gender non-conforming pronouns, by either working with the faculty member, discussing it with them beforehand, but also when you are introducing anything or you're welcoming the class, just say, "Hello class, welcome everyone." If you want to point to a student, just say, "Hi student," or the person in the green shirt, "Can you please stand up," instead of mistakenly gendering them. So it takes a lot of work on our part to learn about these different things. And I can tell you that 2 years ago, I would not have been able to just say my pronouns are she, her, hers, what pronouns are you using today, or any variety of that example there. So it does take time, and I know that as librarians, we are incredibly busy, and it seems like we're going to be more busier than ever before. But if you want to say that we are providing unbiased um, responses to all requests, and that we're striving to be an equitable, inclusive profession and society, that we have to do the legwork. We have to be on our hustle and grind to make sure that we understand all of these content, that we are just not being inclusive for one group, but for all.
Great. Thank you so much, Tawana, for your presentation both today and last week. We really appreciate you spending the additional time to re-record this session. So thank you very much. I wanted to see if you had any last parting words. If not, I think we're about ready to conclude today, but thank you again for being part of this presentation.
I am just happy that ACRL and ODLOS have teamed up to host this webinar, and that my topic, my proposal was accepted. And I will just say a few parting words, that just by listening to this webinar, that you've taken the first step, but this is the first step of many, and it's going to be a long, long, very difficult road, but to not shy away from that, because the work that we do is important to creating a place where people feel like they belong, and to prevent people from having to suffer unduly because we are unaware of their communities and themselves historical traumas and the current traumas that they're currently experiencing. So just taking that opportunity to learn more, reading books like The Topographies of Whiteness, learning more about librarians of color experiences and students of color experiences, underrepresented student experiences, is vital to the work that we do. So thank you all for attending, for participating, and for listening in.